Hey everybody. Thanks for joining me for this session on MongoDB Realm and React Native. We're just about to get kind of started here. Before we really get going, I would just like to take a moment just to acknowledge kind of everything that's going on both in the US and across the rest of the world at the moment. This is obviously a very difficult time. I'm taking most people have already seen the welcome video from our CEO. Obviously, the decision to go ahead with live while everything else is going on has been one that we've considered really carefully. As one of the few actual not recorded actual live sessions going on during it as well, it's something I had to consider myself personally. I would like to draw everybody's attention. I'm just going to start sharing my screen actually so you can see this as well. So hopefully, if you've seen the welcome video, you've also seen that we're currently doing this MongoDB for Good, where we are soliciting donations, any donations that are made during the conference up until, I believe, the 12th of June. MongoDB will be matching up to $250,000. So I would really, if you are able to donate, I would highly suggest that you do. Also, as I kind of go through today, I'm just going to share, I've got a little link here for everybody. I'll put this in chat in a moment. Normally, as I'm kind of going through these sessions, I like to kind of share some of the documentation and things I recommend people read as kind of further reading to help them kind of better understand what we're discussing or the technologies involved. And there is some information in here on there. There's like things like our MongoDB documentation on Realm. What I'd also like to suggest is, okay, so these following books, they may not be exactly, not going to teach you about React or Realm, but as a developer, I really do suggest that you also give them a read as well. It's books like Race After Technology, Algorithms for Oppression, Automating Inequality. As I said, they're not going to teach you about React, but they will make you a better developer, I promise. So all the links for everything that I'm going to discuss today, all the source code, links to these books as well, is all going to be on the following gist, which I will put in chat. If everybody wants to have a look at those or look at any documentation or the source code, etc., it's all going to be there. I'll also kind of keep this as a living document as we go through. So anything else I think of, like the links, MongoDB for Good, etc., I'll add it to this document so you always have kind of the most recent links of what I'm discussing. Okay, so what are we actually going to be discussing today? What are we going to be building today? Well, we're going to be looking at Realm. So Realm is, let's actually bring in the product page. It's probably a little bit better to get an overview of it. So MongoDB Realm is part of our serverless architecture. So it covers things like authentication, serverless functions. It also has our on-device database as well. So our on-device database, for anybody who's used Realm in the past, is probably what they're most familiar with. MongoDB acquired Realm last year. We're working very hard to get it integrated into our own platform. That's really been announced. It's been one of the big things we've been announcing at MongoDB Live this year, is that integration. So now MongoDB Realm is not just the on-platform database. It also includes things like which were previously known as Stitch. So our serverless functions, authentication, access control, etc. It also now incorporates our offline online sync. So the ability to have a application on your device that will automatically do sync up to MongoDB Atlas, and then from Atlas back down to the device and do conflict resolution and all that kind of stuff for you. Okay, so that's the technology we're going to be discussing mostly today. But what are we going to build? So we're going to be using React Native to create a mobile application that's going to be essentially flashcards. So for anybody who's not aware of what flashcards are, they are a teaching aid, commonly used in classrooms, etc. You'll see them for teaching kids the alphabet. So H is for hand, S is for ship, etc. They're also used a lot for practicing, for example, coding interviews. You'll have your different code examples on a card and then a description of it. They're used for teaching different languages, etc. So really, all a card is essentially what you want to learn and a description of it. They're memory aids. They're a way of allowing you to prompt yourself to remember what it is you're trying to learn and reinforce that learning over time. So with the flashcards app, the important things that we want to cover is, well, we want to have the information available at any time. We want to be able to study anywhere and everywhere that we want to, regardless of whether we have an internet connection or not. So it's maybe not as relevant in COVID times, but say we were on a subway or we were on a plane or whatever else, and we wanted to continue studying, then we don't want to have an internet connection to retrieve our card decks. We want it to be on our device. But we also might want to share those card decks. We might be in a group project, we might be working on something together. We may be a teacher that has a classroom and wants to share their decks with the class. So we want to have some way of not just being able to store it on the device, but also sync it up to our cloud and then do any conflict resolution. So if I am working in a group project and I've made modifications to the cards while I am offline, then whenever I come back online, those will sync up with the modifications being made by my colleagues in my group. So that's essentially what flashcards are. I think it'd probably be helpful to show you the end. We're going to skip ahead and show you what the end result is going to look like for this. So in my terminal here, I'm just going to run my React Native run iOS. So what this is going to do is it's going to launch the iOS simulator. Hopefully you can see it on the screen now. The simulator is going to open up. We can see now that React Native is building my application from the JavaScript codes. It's going to bundle this all up. We're probably going to get an error here because it's going to be looking for the bundle. Yeah, so let's just wait for this to refresh. We can force a new build of the bundle. And once that's complete, loaded onto the device, we get our interface. So first thing we have is our login. I've already created a user for myself, so I'm just going to log in here very quickly. And it's just gone and fetched my projects from MongoDB Atlas. We can see I have one deck of cards here called JavaScript, which is MongoDB JS driver examples. I can view that deck. And we can see now I have my different flashcards. So a flashcard is made up of several elements. We have this little bar at the top is kind of a priority indicator. So if something is super important that I really want to learn, then I can have this kind of red bar. I have a title for the card. I have the code that I want to learn, and I have a description of the code beneath it. And I can flip through these cards. So I've got multiple cards here. I can flip back and forward through, moving through them, or I can view the cards as a list. So here we have like a regular kind of list view. I have the card, I have the description, the title of the card, the description of the card. I have the delete icons here. If I want to remove the card, I can delete the entire deck. So I can delete all cards and then delete the deck itself. I can add new cards. So here we've got a card title, code, description, etc. I can choose what language it is that I am trying to learn. So these ones are JavaScript. And I can set that priority, so that little status heading at the top of the card, all under create cards. Let's come back to your card view again, just quickly. So you can see there's our card view we're flipping through and our deck view. And then once I'm done, I can log out. It's going to take me back to that screen. Okay. So that is the end product that we're going to be working towards today. Now, obviously this is a very quick kind of tutorial. We've got 90 minutes to work through. There's a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to go through a lot of the boilerplate that's required within React Native to set this up. So things like the forums, etc., would have a lot of that pre-written for us, so we don't need to sit and watch me type out a bunch of kind of JSX or anything like that. Don't worry. I'm going to just really focus on the nitty-gritty of the Realm stuff that we're looking to do here. So things like being able to create new decks, add cards to them, set up our sync, do our authentication, the stuff that is really just related to Realm. The other stuff around React itself, I'm just going to assume that most people are familiar with React, they're familiar with kind of modern JavaScript, and I won't really be going into much depth on that. Now, in this gist that I provided before, I do have some links to some JavaScript tutorials here. There's a couple on getting started with modern JavaScript, so looking at kind of ES10, I think it is. There's also one here for learning React itself, and then there's React Native docs, the getting started guide there. So If you're not overly familiar with JavaScript, React, React Native, etc., I really do recommend that you go through some of these tutorials another time. They'll help you kind of understand what we're doing. I also have a few different packages that I've got here. The main three is UI Kitten. So UI Kitten is going to provide a lot of the components that I'm going to be using. Things like the icons that are there. You can have a look at some of the components here. So it's going to provide things like icons for me. It's going to provide some of the other ones I need, like for my forms. It's going to give me my inputs, etc. So a lot of that's where all the styling is coming from for a lot of what you're going to see. I'm not writing these components from scratch. I'm going to be using this component library for a lot of it. Highlight.js to do the actual syntax highlighting for the code examples that we see there. It's another very important part. And then for the cards, we're going to be using this snap carousel. So as you can see, it's exactly what we need for the cards. It has lots of different kind of styles and applications, etc. So that's going to be providing a lot of what we require. So much of the stuff that we've looked at in the UI, that's going to be taken care of for us by a lot of these dependencies. And then we're just going to focus really on the Realm code. The code that we're going to be looking at itself is also available online. You can find it here at the source code for tutorial, which is going to link to my GitHub, and you'll see the code in there for the finished finished application. Okay, so let's get started. So we have our application fully built at the minute. I'm going to instead check out my tutorial branch here. And that's going to refresh, and we're going to see, okay, so we've gone from being a full app to not much left. And the first thing we're going to need before we can actually start building in our app is to set up our MongoDB cluster and our Realm application. We're going to need a couple of variables from there that we're going to populate into our code, so let's go get those first. Now, I'm currently in the MongoDB Cloud interface, so I've logged into my MongoDB Cloud account. I've got a project here, flashcards. I already have a cluster spun up, but I'm going to take you through creating a new cluster just so we can see how that works. So this is in Atlas. This is going to be where we're storing our data. I'm going to create a new cluster. So I can pick the region for my cluster. I'm going to stick with US East, that's closest to where I am at the moment. My cluster tier, I don't need an M30 for this. An M10 should be fine. My MongoDB version, I'm going to have to use a 4.4 beta. This is very cutting edge stuff they're working on at the moment. So I'm going to set that here. And I can change the cluster name to whatever I want it to be. I'm just going to leave it at cluster 1 for now. And I create cluster. So my cluster is being created. We can see at the top here, I do have some information about that. Tell me kind of like how far along the creation process is. It's showing me here that new clusters can take between 7 to 10 minutes to provision. So we're not going to wait on that. And so I'm going to show you some other things. So my network access I've already set up. It's allowing global access, which is I've put in for development use only. Obviously, if I was doing this in production and instead I was using like my current IP address rather than the whitelist address, what I would recommend is if you do need to switch in development for a while, is you can use this toggle to say like, okay, I'm going to use the all zeros, but I want it to be removed within 6 hours. So once I've finished this development, it's going to kick me back out again. I already have this set up for this project, so that's fine. One thing to note is I don't have any users set up because our access to the cluster is not, we're going to be accessing it directly. We're going to be accessing it using our Realm app, which is going to have its own users and authentication. So I don't need to worry about this just now. Then on the Realm tab, we have a look here. So I can create a new Realm app. I can give it a title. I'm just going to give it flashcards. I can link it to a cluster. So this cluster is currently being created. I'm not sure if it's actually going to let me link it. Let's give it a try. Okay, just letting me link it even while it's being created. That's great. And now that I'm in Realm, it's asked me to create a schema. So for the sync, we need to create a schema to let MongoDB know what data we want to sync. I'm going to just click on this get started. Now, I don't have any collections, etc. So instead, I'm going to go into sync, and I'm going to turn on dev mode. So the difference here is once I have my schema set, I know what my data looks like. I know what I want to be syncing. I can then generate a JSON schema. I can load that into my Realm app. At the moment, I'm in development mode. I'm not quite sure what data I want to be syncing. I'm not quite sure what my data schema is going to look like. I'm not sure like what my structure is going to be. I can start this up in dev. So in development mode, I just need to pick my cluster. I can set a database name of flashcards. And then within my partition key, I'm going to set a partition of partition. Now, partition key is quite important. Partition key allows you to partition the data that is synced down to the device. So whenever I've got my Atlas database set up, my cluster set up, it's going to have a lot of different information in there. You know, it might have information for multiple different users, multiple different classrooms or groups, or however we want to partition this. And not every person is going to need to have all of that data on their device. You know, for a particular user that may only their own data may be relevant to them, or only the data from their study group, etc. We don't want them pulling down everything or syncing everything that's in our Atlas cluster. That's going to be wasteful on their bandwidth. It's going to be wasteful on the memory on their device. So we use partitions essentially to say that this is the data that is relevant to this particular user. And we create this using a partition key. We can name it really whatever we want, and field type is string, which we'll see later on. Now, once I turn this on, that's going to give me a notification, let me know that development mode is on, that's fine. And the next thing I want to do then is set up my users. So I don't have any users currently. What I also don't have really is any providers. So the provider I'm going to set up here is email password. So very straight kind of authentication, login via email password. Let's get this set up. So I'm going to enable this provider. I can set a confirmation method. So I can ask them to send a confirmation email, or I can run my own confirmation function. I'm just going to automatically confirm users. No need to verify their email address. Password reset method. Again, I can send a password reset email. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a password reset function, and I'm going to define a new function. And it's going to give me some kind of boilerplate here I can use. Now, my password reset function here is just going to do nothing. It's just going to return fail. We're not worried about doing resets at the moment. We're just going to enable this. So any of our kind of registrations and things are going to be done through the add new user anyway. So we've got our provider set up. If I was to attempt to use a new user at this point, it wouldn't let me, because while I've done all these changes here, I've not deployed them yet. So I can review my changes. I can see that development mode has been enabled, that I've set up a new auth provider, that I have, you know, my different configurations around kind of authentication, my password reset function, etc., is all in here. So yeah, deploy is going to fail because that cluster ID is not up and running yet, so that's fine. Instead, what we're going to look at is I've already created a app for us, so I wouldn't have to wait for that cluster to spin up. If I go and view it, we can see within this app, there is the user that I created earlier, this RM asset of MongoDB that we saw me log in with. And we can actually check in the logs as well. We can see, you know, here's my authentication login, and there's like my sync sessions, etc. So this is the realm app that we were looking at in the demonstration earlier is connected to. And this realm app is then connected to the cluster that I prepared earlier as well. So this cluster is still being created, but we have this cluster that's already up and running. So that's what we're going to be working with today. So let's go back into my existing Realm application. And one of the things we're going to need is this app ID, which we'll see in a second. So now we have our cluster set up in Atlas. We have our Realm app set up and configured. We have our authentication method set up. We're finally ready to begin our app. So at the moment, you know, all we have is just dumping us into this like your deck screen, which is not correct. We first wanted to go for authentication. We first want people to have to log in. So in order for them to log in, we need to be able to connect to Realm and then do our authentication using the Realm SDK. Now, let's have a look at our code here. I've already run through and installed all of my node modules. Here we go. So I've got like my package JSON here, and I've installed all these modules, so you don't have to sit and watch me go through the installation. They're all in there. It's already been done. We can see here my node modules, you know, things like kind of Realm and React, etc., will be already installed. Like any other node modules folder, it is huge, so they'll be down here somewhere. Just keep scrolling. Yeah, so we got like a React's already installed there. realms installed. So all of those packages being installed for me. We don't need to sit and watch me do an npm install. So first thing I want to do is then create a way of referencing our realm app. So I have this get realm app file here, which I can start populating. So the first thing I want is, let's import our realm from realm. Okay, so we've got our realm imported from our library, and we're going to just create a app variable that's going to hold a reference to our realm app. Now we're going to leave that just undefined for the moment. The reason for that is we're going to create a function that's going to check to see if there is an existing realm app. If there is, then it's just going to return that realm app. If it's not, it's going to create it. That way we're not creating multiple references to the same kind of realm connection. So let's create our function. We're going to export get realm app. It doesn't need any arguments at this point. And then we can do, if our app that we can set there is undefined, so we don't currently have a reference to realm, then we're going to do something. Otherwise, it's just return app. So if this function's already been called, we already have a reference to realm, then we can just return that. So the first thing it's going to need is that app ID that I mentioned briefly there. So let's pop back to our browser, and I can grab this app ID here. So this is going to be a reference to my realm application. Let's pop that in. And I'm going to create a config object. So let's just call it app config. And that's going to be a dictionary. And in our app config, well, it's going to need ID that we just set. So let's pass that in here. It's also going to need the URL for realm, which is realm.mongodb.com. So that's where it's going to connect to. It's going to need a timeout. So let's give it a timeout of 3 seconds. And then we'll get some additional configuration around the app itself. So that needs a name. Let's just leave that at default's fine. And it's going to need a version as well. This is a very early version, so we're going to set that to 0. And that's us done for our config. And then finally, we need to actually set this app itself. So let's just do app equals new, and we're going to use our realm.app, and we're going to pass into that our app config. Great. So when we call our get realm app, if app doesn't currently exist, if it's undefined, then we're going to create a new realm app. Or if we've already called this function and we have app exist, then we're just going to return that. So that's great. So we have a reference now that we can start connecting to realm. So next thing we're going to need to do is create our auth provider. So providers are a way in React of essentially creating context that can be passed between different components. And we're going to use our providers to do all of the interaction with realm. So whether that is going to be doing our authentication, so interacting with realm's kind of login, logout methods, whether it's going to be fetching our decks. So when we get to the point of actually having our deck of cards, creating new cards, fetching our cards, it's all going to be done via providers. Those providers then are going to create new React context objects where it's going to store this data for us. And then any child components within this provider will have access to that data. So they'll have access to the user to see if they're logged in or out. They'll have access to the decks we fetched for that user, and so on and so forth. So the first thing that we're going to do for our auth provider then is, well, it's React, so we're going to import React. This is going to be a React component, so that's the first thing we need to do. I also know that I'm going to be using use context because I'm going to create a new context, and I'm going to be using use state because I'm going to be adding things to the state. So let's import those from React. I also am going to be using realm, so let's import that from realm. And I'm going to be using my get realm app that I just created. So let's just import get realm app from, and that's in get realm app. Great. So that's all of our imports we're going to need for this section. And now we can start creating things. So first of all, we're going to need a reference to our realm app. So let's just call that get realm app. Create our realm app and pass it back to us. And we're going to need our auth context. So let's just create that now as well. So we're just going to create a new React, create context, and it's just going to be null for now. And now we can start on our actual React component. So I've got an auth provider. it's going to wrap a bunch of other components. So I'm going to pass the children into it. And then we're going to need to know what the user is and some way of setting the user. So that's where we're going to use our set state here. And whenever we first call this, our user is going to be null. So we're not logged in yet. We're just going to have a null user. We're also going to need a couple of functions. So let's say we're going to need a login function, which is going to be async. And that's going to take, well, we're doing our email password as our authentication. So it's going to require an email and password. That's our login, and then we're going to need a logout as well. So let's just define that too. So logout is not going to need anything. It doesn't require any arguments. There we go. So we got that stubbed out. So for our login, first thing we're going to need to do is create a credentials object. So with Realm, there's multiple different ways that you can authenticate. You saw in the Realm app. Let's look at it very quickly again. Under users, we had these different providers. Now I'm using email password, but it's like Facebook, Google, Apple, API keys, custom Java Web, JSON Web Tokens, etc. There's a bunch of different providers you can use here. I've just got the email password to turn on for now. So I'm going to define a new credentials object, which is going to be a email password credentials object, which is going to take the email and password. Okay, so we have our credentials object. Let's pass this now to, we're going to create a new user, and that new user is going to use our Realm app that we've created, and it's going to call the login function with the credentials that we presented above here. So should this succeed, then our new user is going to be a reference to our authenticated user. So let's set that user to new user. Okay, great. And then we're also going to need to log out. So first of all, we can only log out if we have a user. So if user is currently null, nobody to log out, let's just return. But if we do have a user that's not null, then we're just going to call a logout function on our user, and then we're going to set that user to null as well. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that we have this context that's being set in React. So whenever we first start this up, our user is going to be null. Then we have a login function that takes an email and password. It uses our Realm app to log them in with those credentials, and then it's going to set that user to our authenticated user. Now, what you may notice here is there's no error checking. So if this login fails for whatever reason, it's actually going to raise an exception, and we're going to catch that during the authentication flow and display the error message for it. So our login is very simple here. And our logout, again, very simple. First check we have a user. If we don't have a user, nobody to log out, then we log them out, and then we make sure that this user no longer contains a reference to our authenticated user. Instead, we set that back to null. So once we have all of those done, we now need to return our actual component. So we're going to be returning this off context that we defined above. It's going to be a provider, and then it's going to have as its value the things that we've just defined. So it's going to have a reference to login, and it's going to have a reference to logout, and it's going to have our user. So that's all of the things that this provider, this is off context, is going to provide. And then because this is going to wrap all of our child components, we're going to just pass in children here. Okay, so this provider then is going to receive all of our child components, and it's just going to wrap them in this context, and then it's going to return them again. And then the final thing we need to do is to create our hook. So we're going to create a use off hook, which is not going to take any arguments, and that is going to return, let's define our off, which is going to be using our context from above, and that is going to be our off context. Okay, so, we're missing an equal sign. Okay, so our off is going to use this off context. So we can call use off, same as we call like use state or use effect, etc., to get a reference to this. Of course, we can only do it within that provider. So if our off is null, so we can see up here, if it's off context is still null, then we probably should throw an error. Let's just say throw a new error, can only be called within off provider. Great. And otherwise, we're just going to return off. And then we're going to like just export these out. So I'm just going to, you need to watch me type that out. Let's just do this. There we go. Okay, so we have our login, we've got our log out, we've got our provider, etc. Wonderful. So now if we go to our main app.js, we can see we have this app body component. Our app body component is responsible for rendering all of our components. So if we're looking at it at the moment, it's just rendering out this screen. So in React Native, we have this idea of a navigation container and stacks, and then screens. So screens is your individual screens within your application. So essentially this. We can see here that a screen, as well as having a name, which is rendered at is how you reference it, and a title, which is rendered at the top. It also has a reference to a component, and that is the component that's going to be rendered on that screen. So in this instance, I simply have a text component, which is rendering your Dex Go here. Okay. So everything that's within app body, within this component, is getting wrapped in here by our application provider, which is just part of our theming. But what we're also going to wrap it in then is within our auth provider. We want everything within our application to be able to use that auth provider to access our user, so we can check that somebody is logged in before they do anything, etc. So we're going to import our auth provider. We're going to import that from our, you can tell that I'm also a Python dev, where we do we did the other way around. So I might do that wrong every now and again. Sorry, this is like in providers, auth provider. Okay, so we have our auth provider being imported, and now we can just wrap our body in our auth provider. It's not going to make any changes yet. Everything's still the same. But then in our app body, well, now because we have it wrapped within that auth provider, we can use that use auth that we had previously. So what I'm going to do then is let's just import that here as well. So we have our use auth, which is being brought in from the auth provider within my component here. Then I can do, like const, and I'm going to need a reference to user to check if they're currently logged in. And that's going to come from our use auth that we just imported. So in our auth provider, this is what I've been before. So we have these different values like user that are being exported because our app body, because this component that we're currently editing here, app body, is within the auth provider. Then it can use this use auth, which means it's going to get a reference to this context, which is going to have our login, our logout, our user, etc. on it. Okay, so in here we can call this use auth. It's going to return, these different values, one of which being user, and that's what I'm assigning to the const user here. Okay, so now user can be one of two things. If they haven't authenticated yet, user's going to be null. That's the default state for it. Until they run this login, user's going to be null. So within our return statement here, well, I can check for that. I can go, so user equals null. So is our user currently not logged in? And if they're not logged in, I can just like return some text saying, log in, please. Or if they are logged in, then I can return all the other stuff that I want to return. So let's just wrap our navigation container in that. Okay, so we're saying like if user's null, log in. If not, show the Dex. So let's leave this up now, and here we go. So I've not put it into a view, so it's like way up here. I hope you can see it, but it does say login, please, up there. So we can see this is working now. Not very useful that we've just got like this login, please. We need to give them a form that they can log in with. So I've already created a view for this called our login view. And our login view is going to like have a nice image background, say like we had at the top when we first logged in, and it's going to have this login form. And the login form is really simple kind of form we're just going to look at here, which is a couple of fields. So we have our form. Initially, our email is going to be blank. So we're not going to have an email set. Our password is going to be blank as well. Then we have our fields for that. So we have an input field here for email address, and we can see that I have this set to keyboard type of email. I have a placeholder for it, and as we modify the values of that, it's going to set this variable email for me. And I have another input for my password. It's a secure text entry, so it's not going to show the text. And much like email, as we change the values, then it's going to update the value of password. I also have a little text field here with a danger status on it, which is going to show any errors. So if we have any authentication errors, they're going to be displayed in there. Okay, and then finally we have this button, and when we press the button, it's going to call this handle submit, which is going to be on form submit, which is in our login view. So here is you can see we've got our errors been defined, but we're using our state and they're currently null, so we don't have any errors yet. And then we have our on form submit function, which is going to be called by our login form whenever somebody hits that button. So this is the thing that we wanted to modify first then to allow people to log in. So again, this is part of the authentication. So the first thing we're probably going to want to do is import our use auth. It's within that auth provider, so we don't need to worry about it not being available, and we can just get that from providers, auth provider. And then we can set down here, well, what do we need for this? In this instance, we're not looking for the user. We know the user's not already logged in because we just redirected them here. We're going to need the login functionality. So we're going to get our login functionality from this use auth. Okay, so we now have a reference to our login function. Our login function is going to require an email and password. So within here then, well, first of all, let's set any errors back to null. So if they've already tried to log in, they've got an error displayed, let's remove that error first. And then we're going to do this try, because we know that this auth provider in this login function, if something goes wrong with this login, it's going to raise an exception. So let's catch that exception. So we're going to try here, and then we're just going to await login. And we're going to call that with our email and our password that's getting sent from our login form. And hopefully that's going to work okay. If it doesn't, it's going to raise an exception. So after our try here, then we can catch that exception. And let's set our error text. So the exception is going to actually be a JSON string that we're going to get back. So let's parse that JSON string, which is going to be on the message attribute of our exception. And the human readable text is just called error. So we submit the form, we run our login, we give it the email password that was provided to us. If that login fails for whatever reason, it's going to raise an exception. We're then going to set our error message, which is going to display in our login form. So let's try saving that up and have a look at our app again. Okay, so let's try refreshing this. Oh, we're still getting it to your login, please, because we haven't actually imported this yet. We're still got our text entry here. So we need to import our new view here. So this is going to be, we called it login view, and that's from our views folder, login view. Save that, and then we can just swap out this text element we have here with our login view. And, sorry, capitalization matters in React, folks. So log capital I in view. There we go, we have our login. So now if I attempt to log in, we can see I can successfully log in. We're just showing the your index here thing again. So that's fine. And now I'm back to, let's check our error message. So let's put invalid things. We're going to get invalid username and password. Let's remove our password, invalid password, and so on and so forth. Okay. So we're getting our error messages here, and then when we have a successful login, we now see our decks. This is where our deck's going to be rendered. Okay. And we can see that's in this bit here. Now, we haven't actually started saving any decks yet or defined what our decks are. Remember, when we looked at our realm app and we were setting up our sync, we put it in dev mode so we can just define our schema as we go. that's what we're going to do in this next section. So I already have like a schema file created here. And the first thing I'm going to create is the schema for my deck itself. Now I'm only going to need one import. I'm going to import object ID from BSON. So object ID is a special BSON type that we're going to be using for our primary keys. You can read more about that in the documentation. So let's create our deck class. So first thing we're going to need is let's create a constructor, which is going to take the different values that we're going to need for our to create our deck. So we're going to need like title was one, description was another. Our partition, we're going to need that as well, so we know which partition this deck belongs to. And then we're just going to need to give it an ID, which is going to be set to that object ID. Okay, so we have ID, new object ID. We're just going in from here, perfect. And then within our constructor, we're just going to go like this dot partition, which I need to spell correctly, is equal to partition, this, and it's underscore ID in our database. So let's just change that to underscore ID. List dot title equals title. List dot description equals description. So not decode here, description. There we go. Okay, so our constructor, whenever I create a new deck, is going to populate the different values for me. And then the next thing I need is to define the actual schema itself. Strictly speaking, this is really all that I need is just this dictionary that defines the schema. But creating it as an object like this, I find makes it a lot easier to create later on. So, as a class like this means I can call this constructor, and it makes it a lot easier for me to build new objects. But really, strictly speaking, this is all we need for our schema is just this dictionary. So it's named deck, and then we've got our different properties. So our properties are going to be the things I've just defined, so our underscore ID, which is of type object ID, our partition, which is of type string, etc., etc. I'm not going to make you watch me type all of these out. Instead, I'm just going to copy and paste it from here. Okay, so we have our constructor for our deck. We have our schema with our different properties. This one's interesting. So we're not defining cards here in our constructor, but we have a cards property, which is of type card, which is an array. So we can see this card, and we're defining that this is an array or a list by giving it the square brackets. So this is going to be like a sub document within our deck. So this is what's going to have the different cards within our deck itself. So let's define our card schema as well. Okay, so here we have our card. Again, we have our constructor. It's going to take a title. It's going to have the codes, the language, the priority, description, ID, all the things that we saw in the front end whenever we looked at our card. The priority, remember, is that little colored strip along the top. So we have all these things set here. So we have all the things we're passing in are being set on our card class. Then we have our schema again, which defines them all. IDs and object ID, rest are strings. And again, we have our primary key set as ID. So that is our schemas defined. So now we know what we're saving. What we need to create now is a way of being able to interact with these in Realm. Much the same as we did for our auth provider. This was how we interacted with Realm there, is we need to do something very similar for our decks and for our cards. Now, we didn't need to provide a schema for our authentication because that's all done for us. We're using the built-in authentication within Realm, so we didn't need to provide a schema for that. We're just using the credentials, the structure of credentials that are already there. But we still had this auth provider, which was how we interacted with Realm. We can see here we're getting our Realm app, did our logins, logouts, all that kind of stuff. So for our decks, we're also going to need to have a provider that does these interactions for us too. We could do it within the individual components themselves, but a lot of our components are going to share access to the deck. So things like the deck list is going to need access to the decks, to show the actual deck details and the cards and everything else. They all will need to access this information. So rather than having to either pass it down through all of our components as props or query it every single time a component is mounted or unmounted, instead we're going to write a new provider that's going to get once we've authenticated, download our sync our list of decks and make them available to all the other components within our app. So we're going to write a decks provider. So our decks provider is going to be very similar to what we had before. One of the things we are going to need that we didn't have before is we're going to need to have a reference to our schemas. So we're going to import those from our schema that we just created. So this one here, our card and our deck. So we're importing both of those into our provider. And then it's going to need much the same things that we had previously. It's going to need our React, and it's going to need context and use effect, and et cetera, et cetera. So let's just pop all those in, okay? So we're also going to be referencing our auth provider within our DEX provider, because we can only fetch our new DEX, or sorry, we can only sync our DEX whenever we have a authenticated user. We're not allowing people to be unauthenticated in this one. There's no anonymous users. You have to be authenticated in order to sync your data. So we're going to need to have reference to the user. So we're going to have this use off in here. And then the other thing we're going to need as well is we're going to need to have our context. So let's create a new context object, react.create context. I'm going to set that to null again. Okay, so we have our constant here for that. Again, it's going to be set to null, and we'll create that later on. And then we can start on our provider. So DEX provider looks very similar to how we did our auth provider. Again, it's going to wrap a bunch of components. So we're going to need to pass our children into it. But what it's also going to take is a project ID. So this project ID is what we're going to be using as our partition value. So remember we talked about partitions previously. We've set them up within our realm app, and those are going to control what data this particular realm is interested in, what it's going to sync from Atlas to ensure it doesn't get all of the data. That's going to be defined by our project ID. And we'll pass that into this provider whenever we use the component in a moment. Okay, so we have our DEX provider. It's going to, we've already talked about the fact it's going to need to have a reference to the user, because we're only allowing authenticated users to access this realm. Its main thing that's going to be controlling is our DEX. So we're going to need to have some state, which is going to be our DEX and our set DEX, which whenever we first load this, we're not going to have, we're not going to have any information for it. So we'll set that to an empty array. And then we're going to need to reference to our realm as well. So we're just going to create this ref, and it's going to be null to begin with too. Okay, so we got a realm reference. We have variables to hold our DEX and to hold our set DEX. We can update the DEX, and we have a reference to the user that is currently authenticated. We're also going to have a config file, a config dictionary, which is going to set a few things for us. So number one, it's going to tell our realm what schemas we're interested in. So we're interested in DEX. And so we want to load our DEX schema, and we're also interested in cards as well. So we're going to load our card schema. This is what I was saying before, that whenever I'm defining this config, I could have just passed in a dictionary here, from our deck. I literally could have just given it this, or just given it this. We really need to define a class for our cards or for our deck. All it requires is this dictionary. But defining a class with a constructor that allows us to create a new card object or a new deck object makes things easier later on, which you'll actually see in a moment when we go to create a deck. So, but you could it'd be just as valid to pass in the dictionary and nothing else here. So we know which schemas that we're interested in. We're interested in deck, we're interested in card, and now we need to tell it what to sync. So first of all, we're going to give it reference to our user, so our authenticated user, and then we're going to tell it what our partition value is as well. So our partition value is going to be our project ID. So that string that we're passing in here, project ID. So that's what we're going to be using as our partition value. So we're telling our realm that we're interested in syncing to this user related to this project. And that's all we need for our config. So let's move into our use effect. So for those not really familiar with React hooks, use effect is similar to the component will mount components on mounts, that kind of idea. So it's going to be called whenever this component first mounts, and also whenever there's changes made to certain data. And we want it to also be called whenever there's a change made to the user. So we might be syncing data for a different user, or when there's a change made to project ID. So essentially, whenever our partition value changes, so the users like switch projects or log into somebody else, etc., then we want to rerun this use effect. So that's how we tell it what we want to watch for, what we're monitoring. We're monitoring the user, we're monitoring project ID. Any changes to those is going to force us to reload our DEX from the realm again. So we have to have a user. So let's just make sure that the user that we're getting from our use off here is not null, so they have logged in. If they haven't logged in, we're just going to exit out of this early because, well, we can't really do anything at that point. And now we have our user, we can start opening our realm. So we're going to do realm.open. It requires that config we created, so it knows what to open. And then, we're going to wait for that to happen. And then it's going to have a callback here that we're going to pass in our newly opened realm to, and then we're going to run this function. So we open our realm with this config. We tell it what schemas we're interested in, and then we wait for that realm to open, and it's going to trigger this callback. So first thing we're going to do is let's set our ref here. So we've got our realm ref.current equal to our newly opened realm. And then we are going to get our DEX. So we're going to do sync DEX. These are our new DEX. We want to sync between our cluster and our application. And they are going to be opened realm objects, and it is our DEX object that we're interested in. Okay, so we now have all of our DEX stored in that const. We also want to ensure that anytime that there's a change to these, that we're refreshing that. So we're going to set a listener on our opened realm. So we're going to go like open realm, add listener, and we're going to listen for any changes that are made to our realm. Again, it's going to call this callback. In this callback function, we're just going to set our DEX. So up here, set DEX, and we're going to set them to our sync DEX as a array. So sync DEX is actually going to be an object. It's going to be an object where the keys are strings of 0 to whatever number of DEX we have. So we're going to use the spread operator to turn that into an array. And then we're not going to wait for this. We need to trigger it straight away as well. So we're just going to do set DEX here, and we're going to do the same thing. So we've got our change event handler, and also the first time this runs, it's also going to set our DEX to our new DEX. Now, there's one thing that we've missed on this is we also need to do some tidy up. In React, within use effect, so this is going to run whenever a component mounts. If we want to run something when the component unmounts, then we do it within the return value. So we're going to return a function from our use effect, and this function will only be run whenever we are unmounting this component. And what we wanted to do is, if this component is unmounted, is do some tidy up. So first of all, we're going to get our reference to our realm. So const realm is going to be equal to our realm ref.current. So this existing realm that we have that we're opening up here. So we're going to get a reference to that, and then we, assuming that realm is not null, so that the realm currently exists, then we're going to first of all remove all listeners. So like that change listener, etc., that we set there. Let's get rid of all of those. We're going to close the realm, and then we're going to set our realm ref.current to none. Okay, so whenever this component unmounts, it's going to remove a reference to our realm and close our listeners, close the realm itself. And we could, unfortunately, get into a little bit of problem with this because opening our realm, remember, has a callback. So this doesn't happen instantly. So we could get in a situation where our component is unmounted, we're still waiting this callback to run, we start to close on our realm, and then this just immediately reopens it. So what we're going to put in here is let's set a canceled variable to true. And then we're going to have this as like basically a guardian variable. So we'll set it before we open our realm. Let's say canceled is equal to false. And then whenever, so we're saying canceled false here. If it gets set to true, so if the component unmounts before this finishes opening, then we need to go, okay, so we no longer need this realm. So we're going to do like if canceled. So for canceled has been set to true while it's been opening, then we're going to do like opened realm dot close, we'll just immediately close it, and we'll return so we don't run anything else. Okay, so if the component gets closed while this callback is awaiting, we're just going to cancel the opening of the realm and close it back down again. So that is our reference to the actual realm, and it's going to allow us to load our decks. Once those decks are loaded, they're going to be stored in this variable here. So we're going to have our decks populated with any decks from our cluster. But we also need our providers also going to control creating of decks and deleting of decks and all the other ways we interact with our realm. Much the same as our auth provider, controls our login, controls our logout, as well as stores reference to the user. Our decks provider is going to store reference to our decks and also give us the functions we need to interact with those decks. So the first one we're going to need is like, well, create a deck. We can't delete anything or we can't create a card until we've got a deck. So let's create a deck. It's going to be an async function. And all it's going to need is a title and a description. Okay, so we got a title description. And within that, then we're going to need a reference to our realm again. So let's see, realm equals realm ref.current. And then we're going to be writing information. So anytime we're changing information within our realm, it's going to happen within a call to write. So we've got a write. We can just wrap this within its own function here. And we're going to say that, okay, we're going to do a realm.create. What's our realm going to create? Well, it's going to create a deck. So it knows the type of object it's going to create. And then we're going to say that we're going to use our new deck. Our deck is going to take a title, which is going to be equal to title, and a description, which is going to be equal to description, funnily enough. But what it's also going to need is that partition value. So let's say our partition is going to be equal to, and that's going to be this project ID that we pass in at the top. So we can say partition equal to project ID. So we've got our new deck has been created. It's within our realm.write, and that's it. So we can call this create deck now, get title description. It's going to write to our realm. It's going to create a new instance of deck, and it's going to store the values in there. We don't need to worry about sync or anything like that. We just do the write. It's going to store it on our local device, and it's also going to sync that up to our Atlas cluster and then down to any other connected devices for us. And it's the same thing for create a card. So I'm not gonna like write this whole thing out. I'm just gonna, okay. So you can see create a card is exactly the same thing. It's just got a few more pieces of data that it requires, language priority, etc. Again, it's just going to be a write. Now in this instance, I'm assigning the return of my new card to a variable, because rather than doing my realm.create, is I'm going to push that card onto my deck. So remember in our schema, if we look at our deck schema, we had this cards, which was of type card, which was an array. Well, here we can see that on my deck, my cards array, I'm now going to push this new card. And that's enough for it to actually create the card and to write it to our realm and sync it up, etc. So now we've got a way of creating them. Let's have a way of deleting them. So we're going to delete our deck. It's going to need a reference to the deck to delete. And again, we're going to need a reference to our current realm. And once we've got a reference to our realm, then again, this is making modifications to our realm. So we're going to call it within a realm.write. Just going on this function. Within our realm.write, then we're just going to do realm.delete, and we're going to delete our deck. Now, this technically is enough to delete a deck, but remember, a deck also has multiple cards, and we're not telling it to delete the cards here. We're telling it just to delete the deck. So before we delete the deck, let's make sure we don't end up with any orphan objects, and we're going to do realm.delete deck.cards. And delete can take an array of elements to delete. So we can pass in that full array of our cards here. It's going to delete all the cards. Then it's going to delete the deck itself. Our delete card function is much the same, except we only need to delete the card. We don't need to worry about deleting the deck. So it takes a reference to card and it says our realm.delete card. And then once we have all of these defined, we need to return them as our component. So here we have our deck's context provider, and we're defining these different values that we want to be available to all the children within this provider. So our create deck, our create card, our delete deck, our delete card, our deck's project ID is all going to be available to within the children. And much the same as we had our use off, is we're now going to define this use decks. So again, it's going to be, cancel. So again, it's going to be it has to be called within our deck's provider, and we're going to export those so they can be used anywhere. So here we go. So we have our use decks, same as our use off, and now we can wrap everything within our deck's provider. So in our app body here, we have our login view and we have our decks view. I'm going to add in a few different views for the screens that we're going to need for the rest of this tutorial. So let's just put the rest of these in. We can see here we've got a login view. We have our deck's provider that we've just created with a project ID of my project. It's got our navigation container. So everything within this deck's provider not only has access to the auth provider, so it has access to everything within auth, it also has access to everything within our deck's provider. So it has access to our deck, all our cards, the ability to create decks, delete decks, etc. And we can see we've got our deck list, which is going to show all the decks. We've got our deck detail, card list, etc. So let's save this one up. If we have a look now, great. So I'm already logged in. Let's try logging out. Oh, doesn't work. Can I add one? No, it doesn't work. So we have our project that's currently being listed, but we're not showing anything. We've just got our screens built in here. We need to wire these things up to the different functions that we created. So we need to wire them up to our logout function. We need to wire them up to our create deck function, etc. So let's have a look at the deck list view, which is this one that we're now looking at here. And we can see I've already got most of the stuff imported for us. It's taking this navigation element. It has a reference to our logout function. Running down here, it has a reference to our decks. If you are use decks, remember these are all wrapped within this decks provider, within this auth provider, so they can use both the use off and the use decks. So we have reference to our decks, but none of the stuff is wired up. So they're just buttons that do nothing right now. So first of all, let's wire up our logout button. So if we go down to the bottom of this here, we have our logout, and we see we have the button, but it doesn't actually do anything yet. So let's define our onPress, and we just call our logout function. That's it. Nothing else required. If I go back and try this out, boom, logged out. So that was all we required to do our log out. And then remember, for our login, all we had to call was that login function. Realm handles everything else. It's in all of our authentication for us. We don't need to worry about storing user details. We don't need to worry about anything else in the authentication flow. It's really just two, rather straightforward functions. Less than half a dozen lines each. So now that I'm logged in, or now that I can log in and log out, let's just log myself back in again here. There we go. I think I got my password wrong. Yep, I did. Okay, so I'm logged in. I can log out. I still can't add anything. So I'm getting errors down here. So let's go back to our deck's list view and let's look at our add button. So we have this deck create view, which is an overlay. We saw at the beginning, whenever I hit this button, it's not going to be a different screen. It's going to display a little overlay here, allowing me to add a new project in. And its visibility is being toggled using this is add overlay visible. And we have this set is add overlay visible. So within my button here, within this render plus action, I'm just going to call another onPress, which is going to be equal to anonymous function. And anonymous function is just going to call our sat is add overlay visible and set that to true. Now if I hit this, boom. So we have our deck title, we have our deck description. I can try typing some things in. Create. Oh no, it's not linked up as well. Okay, but we have our create deck method already done. So again, I can go into my deck create view, and we can see here that I have another form. Initial values of title, description are empty. It's got this on submit, form submit, which is going to be called from this button, and our on form submit, it's empty. So let's have a look at what we can do in here. So for our our deck create view, it's getting our values from the form, and we're going to need this use decks. So we've already got it imported, but we're going to need to say that from that use decks, we're going to require our create deck method. Our create deck method was one we defined within our provider here. Create deck, it requires a title description. So inside our form now, we can go like create deck, and it's going to take our title, and it's going to take our description. Okay, so it's going to create a new deck, and then we can just hide that. We can call this set is add overlay visible, set that back to false, and that will hide our overlay for us. Okay, so now if I try this again, it's still got this here. Let's just cancel this out. Or sorry. So deck title, hello, description. Hey folks, create. Okay, so we're getting a promise rejection here of realm.write. So let's just refresh this, make sure everything's coming in okay. I think I probably might have a typo somewhere in my thing, but we'll give it another try first and see. So I got it, sign-ins working okay. Our add project. Oh, we're still getting this rejection. So I'm just going to have a look at our Dex provider over here and just make sure that we've got everything that we need in that. Perfect. Okay, this is looking more healthy now. So if I try creating my title of like new deck, this is a new deck and create. Perfect. Okay, so we can see here, here's a deck that I had created previously that's still in my Atlas cluster. So we can see this is actually syncing now to Atlas and pulling down the one that I created during the demonstration, but we can't view them. So again, as much like we had our log out and our add buttons weren't wired up, these view buttons aren't wired up either. So we're going to look at that. So the view button for these is in this deck item that we're being rendering. You can see the deck item is being passed a reference to the deck. So down here, we've got like our deck list. It's got our decks that are being fetched from Atlas. And for each item in our deck, it's in calling this render item function. And our render item function is then returning this React component called deck item. And it's got a reference to the actual individual deck. So let's look at our component for that. So our deck item component, okay, great. So we can see it's got like some styles. It's got like the title here, which is this bit. It's got our description, which is the bit beneath it. Hopefully you can see the resolution is okay for you to see that on the stream. It's got an accessory write, which is this button, but the button doesn't do anything. So our accessory write here, it's just like returning. It doesn't actually have any functionality at the moment. So we need to tell it that we want to go to a different screen. So we're going to use the React navigation navigate. We're going to navigate to one we haven't looked at yet, which is deck detail or deck detail screen. It's going to need to know which deck we're looking for. So we're going to pass in a parameter of selected deck, which is going to be equal to the deck that we pass to this item. So in our deck list view, each of our decks is going to render item. So we pass as a prop to our deck item, and our deck item then is setting that as a root parameter for our navigation. So I can see that up. Whenever I press this button now, what it's going to call is within our navigation. So within our navigation container here, it's going to call this deck detail. We can see our deck detail is going to load this deck detail view. It's going to pass in some like our root and our navigation to it. It's going to set the title equal to the title of the selected deck. So that's that param that we created here. Selected deck is equal to our deck. So we're
selected deck.title, and it's got a button as well, which is going to allow us to like switch different views. We don't need to worry about that now. What we need to know is that it's going to load a deck detail view, and it's going to pass in this selected deck as a parameter to it. So if we try one of these buttons now, hey, there's our cards. You know, it's all nicely being rendered for us. And we can try switching that view. So pressing this button at the top is this, you know, our accessory, this button that's been passed into our header right. And again, it's doing another navigation. So this time it's calling the card list view. And the card list view is very similar to our deck list view, and then it just renders them as a list, you know, so it's a title, description, but it's got a few extra buttons. So these buttons we can look at here. So we have an add like we had before, but we also have a delete, which isn't wired up yet. So it's not doing anything. So let's look at how we do our delete. So this is on our card list. So let's bring some of these back a little bit and go into our card list view. So our card list view, very similar to our deck list view. You know, we have this list, which receives, instead of our deck, now receives our cards and calls this render item for each card. And our render item calls a card list item, you know, which has some functionality on it to like handle delete card, etc. So the first one then is this handle delete card. You know, so whenever we're pressing this button, it's trying to trigger this function handle delete card, and the handle delete card is not doing anything. So we need to fix that. So in our card list view, our handle delete card is first, we're going to remove the reference to our cards. We're going to set that as an empty list. The reason for this is whenever we delete this card, it's going to delete it like live on our device. You know, it's not making a database write first. These are live objects, so it's going to delete like that object from our device. And if we still have a reference to that object within our state, it's going to die. It's going to cause an error. So first of all, we're going to like remove the reference to the card by setting, you know, our state to an empty list. Then we can delete the card. You know, so delete card, and we're going to pass in this card to delete. And then we can set our cards back to like what's remaining within our current deck. So we can go like our selected deck dot cards. Okay, so remember the selected deck that's been passed around here through our navigation parameters is a reference to the current deck that we're looking at. That deck has subdocuments, which is an array of cards, and we're deleting one card out of that array. Okay, so once we've deleted that card, because this is all live, these are live objects, that card's going to get removed from this selected deck.cards object, and then we can reset our cards, and that's just going to disappear. So we try saving this now, and if I'm like, you know, looking at my decks, looking at my cards, there's like a new deck, let's view my JavaScript deck again. And let's say we want to take this card, and it's gone. Okay, so that card has just been immediately deleted from my deck. It's also will now sync up to my cluster in Atlas, and it'll get removed there as well. Now my delete deck isn't set up yet, so let's go delete our deck instead. But for deleting our deck, again, because this is a live object, if I just called my deck delete function and passed in the deck, we're still like using that object here. It's still our selected deck. You know, we still have a reference to it. It's going to cause an error. You know, React is going to reject that. It's going to say that you're trying to reference an object that doesn't exist because it's a live object and we're immediately going to delete it. So instead, what we're going to do within our delete function is instead of immediately deleting it, is we're going to set this delete on unmount. So I have a parameter delete on unmount, which is currently set to false. And what we're going to do is whenever we press our delete function, is we're going to set this delete on mount to true, and then we're going to navigate away from our from this current deck. So we're going to do navigate, and let's go back to our deck list. Okay, so we're telling it it's not actually going to delete yet. It's just going to mark it as it should be deleted once we're finished using it, and it's going to navigate away to our deck list. So then we can use our use effect. Remember what we said before is like whenever use effect is called, we can return a function, and that function isn't actually executed until after the component unmounts. So we're going to go like use effect. We're going to pass in our anonymous functions use effect, and it's not going to do anything apart from just immediately return our function. And in this function is where we're going to do our actual deck delete. So we're going to say, like if delete on unmounted set, then delete the deck. And then we're going to tell this that we want this effect to only be run whenever our delete on unmount variable changes. So we can just pass this in here, that we only really care about it whenever that changes. So what's going to happen now is this use effect essentially won't do anything until the component unmounts. Then it's going to check to see if we've said this deck should be deleted, like this would be marked for deletion. And if it is, it's then going to call our delete deck. And that delete deck comes from our deck provider. It's this function here, delete deck. So we're importing that using our use decks. We've got delete deck, we've got delete card. So we see this up again. Back to our application, we've got our different decks here. We've got the new one I created. Doesn't have any cards yet, but I can go in here and I can delete deck, and it's gone. Okay, so that delete, as I said, is not just happening on my device. That delete is also going back up to Atlas and will be reflected in every other device that I have connected to it at the moment. Okay, so the delete function, as I said, it's deleting immediately from the device since we synced up. All of this will work offline as well. So even if I don't have a net connection, it will work offline. Once I get a connection, then it's going to start syncing it up. I can't demonstrate that to you now, unfortunately. The iOS simulator does not have the ability to place itself into airplane mode. It inherits its internet connection from the host device. The host device in this case being my laptop that I'm currently using to do this live stream to you. So if I was to kill the internet connection for the iOS simulator to show you that it worked offline, I'm also going to kill my live stream. So unfortunately, you're just going to have to take my word for it that this also works offline, and then we'll sync up all my changes whenever I get a connection again. Speaking of syncing up our changes, the last thing we've got remaining to do is this add button. So we have our create form here, but it's not doing anything. So let's look at this add button. Our add button is in our card list as well. So we have our render plus button here, and it's going to this card create. So card create is going to be defined within our app body, card create view, and it's going to load in this component of card create view, sorry. So let's have a look at our card create view. Similar to what we've had before, we have a form. Form has some form fields. Form has an on-form submit handler, and it's empty. So we're going to need to fill in this on-form submit handler. So our card create view, again, it's within our Dex provider, so it can access our use Dex. So let's import that. I don't have that imported yet. So let's do use Dex from our provider, and that's going to be our Dex provider this time. Providers, Dex provider, and then somewhere in here, I need to create a new constant, which is going to be we're going to need our create card this time rather than our create deck, and that's going to be from our use decks as well. The other thing that we're going to need a reference to in order to create a card is the deck itself. So cards are a subdocument of a deck, so we need a reference to the actual card, and that's going to be passed through our params again. So we're going to go our selected deck, and that's going to be equal to our root params. Okay, so in this root, we're going to pass our selected deck, and we can see that actually in the card create here gets our selected deck, which this is getting from params of the one that called it, and so on and so forth. So we're passing that down for each one. So we have our selected deck, and we have our create card method. So in our form submit, then it's the same as what we did before, except it's got a lot more data that we need to populate. Okay, so we have our create card function, which is being defined within our Dex provider. Somewhere up here, create card. It's going to take a reference to the deck we want to create the card on, title, description, code, language, priority, etc. It's going to create that card for us. And then once we've got a card created, let's navigate back to the card list so we can see that card. So let's pop that in here as well. So we have our list. We can go create card. We'll go to title. Hello, everyone. We can give it some code. Code goes here. Short description. We're going to keep it JavaScript. We're going to make it like priority 3. and we'll create. And if we go to our list tree, sorry, we should see, hello everyone, short description. Okay, so that's our new card's been created. We go back here, we can see that it's linked to this list as well. I can delete that card, it's going to go away. I can delete my whole deck, they'll all go away. And all of these changes that I'm currently making are being reflected in Atlas. So let's just have a really quick look at my cluster so we can see this. This is the cluster I created earlier, my collection. Just taking a little second while it downloads. Okay, so we can see this is all stuff that Realm's creating to manage my sync for me. We don't need to worry about that now. But if we take in our decks, we can see that I have my partition of my project. I have my title JavaScript, is that correct? Yep, title JavaScript. Description of MongoDB JS driver examples. This is my deck. Yep, we can see that there as well. And then it's got reference to all of the cards. Okay, so we've got our cards coming in. They've been sort of in our deck, and everything's being synced up into Atlas. And I didn't need to worry about sync there at all. There was no network code. You know, at no point did I have to like check I have a network connection and check I could connect to database. I didn't even create a database user. You know, I don't have a user to that database. All of it is managed through Realm. You know, all is managed through the Realm user that I created for it. And with the Realm user as well, I didn't define any rules for this one in this instance, but you can also define rules too. So here, my permissions on things is, let's just have a look. I like our schema, got in here. You know, got relationships, not defined yet, but sorry. Got like our schema and things. We got our permissions, which are like still in beta. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to turn this dev mode off for a moment. So what development mode to turn off is like I can now view the JSON schema that was generated. You know, so within Realm, if I go back to, sorry, oh, came one bit too far out. If I now look within my sync here, you know, I've got my configuration and stuff has all been set. I'm no longer in development mode, so sync has been enabled. And what I should be able to view as well is like things like my rules here. You know, for my cards, I could set different permissions and things on it. I don't like have any currently. You know, I've got no rules or anything defined. These are all being synced, so that's fine. The schema is now being set up correctly for me and stuff. And that's all kind of set. I no longer am in development mode, so I need to worry about that. All my rules, sorry, as well as here, you know, I've got my provider, which is my email provider reset function. So I just want to confirm all that kind of stuff we went through before. So this is how I'm controlling access to the database. You know, not through the cluster itself. You know, I never have to generate a database user here. It's all being done through my Realm app. It's where it's controlling all the users, setting all the rules, doing all the sync, everything else. Okay, so I'm going to end my screen share there. I'm afraid I've been very negligent off the chat because it's like in a completely different window. So hopefully people been in, I've had a couple of my colleagues have been in chat as well. Hopefully they've managed to answer people's questions and things there. I know it was a very quick kind of review, summary of what is available in Realm, how to use it. What I would recommend is in the gist that I posted earlier, I'll link that again in the chat just now for anybody who missed it at the start. You know, so in this gist that I've just posted here, there is a reference to the MongoDB University Realm tutorial. So that is a to-do app. It's actually what this was based upon. So it not only covers React Native, it also has examples in there for Realm Server, for Swift iOS, for Kotlin Android. If you go into the RN folder within the Realm tutorial is where the React Native code is for their example, for their tutorial. It's a lot of the stuff like providers and authentication, auth provider, etc., is the same. You'll see a lot of similarities. Doesn't include like a lot of the UI stuff. So if you just want a more bare bones one to kind of cut your teeth on, to to see only the components, etc., that are needed to exactly render it, no bells and whistles, no styling or anything like that, just the native React Native components, the native React Native components. Then you can have a look at the tutorial. The source code is in there. The tutorial itself is in the Realm docs. If you go to, which is linked as well from that gist, If you go to the tutorial section, you'll see one there for React Native with JavaScript. That'll take you through everything that I've done today with regards to setting up your Realm within Atlas, setting up your Realm app, connecting it to React Native, etc. It will also walk you through the Realm tutorial. So the code that is in that repository is also linked from the gist. So as I said, it is very similar to what I've currently been talking through in these last 90 minutes. One of the only major difference is, as I said, it doesn't have a lot of the bells and whistles. So it's actually probably a bit more concise than what we were looking at. It just won't look as pretty. So one last thing before we round up for the day, I'm just gonna turn the screen back on just for a second, is we are collecting any feedback about these tutorials. I'm just gonna put this QR code up. Hopefully everybody can see that. We do value your feedback, so please scan the QR code for the session, leave your feedback. If your feedback is incredibly negative, then you can tell it directly to me. You don't need to put it there. But no, honestly, we really do want any honest feedback about this. So any feedback you can give, whether it's good or bad, please do leave it via that QR code. It helps us improve. So we'll know what we did right, what we did wrong. I really do value it, especially in situations like this where it's not a very kind of normal way to do a presentation. Sitting by myself and talking to an empty room, it's not how we would normally do workshops. I hope people still find it valuable. I hope that you do have feedback for us. As I said, it helps me improve, and it's also the first time we've done this, so it'll help us and inform us in what we can do better next time. So thank you all very much for your attention during this last 90 minutes. If you want to continue the conversation, I think there will be a speakers room available that you'll be able to join me in. There's also our community forum. So the link to the community forum is in that gist as well. But for anybody who wants it, it is under developer.mongodb.com. And then from there, you can click through to community, and it'll open our community forum. Please feel free to leave any questions or any feedback you have there as well. And I'll be checking that over the coming days. You can also contact myself directly. I'm pretty active on Twitter. My Twitter is in that gist too, so please feel free to reach out via there. My DMs are open. So I'm more than happy to hear from people through Twitter if they'd like to as well. If you want to ask me questions directly, I'm always available for that. But as I said, otherwise you can reach us to the community forums, or I'm going to hop off in a moment and go look for the speaker room and try to answer as many questions as I can there as well. So again, thank you very much, everybody, for your spending this 90 minutes with me. I know it was a very quick run through, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again.